expected, and after the pink tide in Latin America and the Arab uprisings turned to a deadly winter, what is left of those changes and what is their future? These questions are at the heart of these special issues of Nakla and Marib, which are available now in print and online, and together organized around three thematic areas. One is Latin America that you'll hear about over the next 2 days. One is Latin America and the Middle East. Due to the legacy of successive waves of migration from Middle East to Latin America in the 20th century, most accounts of this relationship between both regions have focused on Middle Eastern influences in Latin America. But Latin America's influence in the Middle East, direct and indirect, is also deep, long-standing, and wide-ranging. So for instance, and you'll hear about these papers, writing in Nakla, Fernando Camacho Padilla draws on his long experience teaching courses on Latin America at Iranian universities to offer a rich account of how elite and popular perceptions of Latin America inform present-day views about the region. Huzan Mahmoud and Ismail Hamala, Kurdish writers and activists, reveal long-standing fascination with Latin American revolutionary leaders and especially literature among Iraqi Kurds in their quest for autonomy and independence from Baghdad. Lina Miari also traces the study of Latin American revolutionary tracts and of testimonial literature among Palestinian prisoners, an influence that finds new relevance today among new generations of Palestinian youth. Meanwhile, in Marib, Iraqi novelist and literary critic Sinan Antoun, one of our co-conveners, also considers how Latin American writers of the boom generation generated intense followings among generations of youth and intellectuals who read deep resonances in the worlds and in their words and worlds. Comparative regionalism is our second organizing theme. It features contributions that focus on how democracy, neoliberalism, post-neoliberal development, political parties, and social movements manifest themselves in both regions. In Marib, Hiba Bouakar and Rusbelina Cardenas describe, based on their experiences co-teaching courses that compare ethnographic texts on Latin America and the Middle East, how violence appears in the mainstream as the primary tool to tie the two regions together to the detriment of comparative reflection. Kaveh Esani examines the impact of shifting oil politics and the social political histories of oil-producing countries in both regions through the late 20th and early 21st century. Kevan Harris uses the lens of inequality to examine differential contours and democratization and forms of integration into the global economy, finding similarities in the ways that violence, unequal relations within the global north, and conglomerate forms of capitalism have impacted both regions. And while Latin American texts made their way to Israeli prisons during and after the Intifada, Sara Awartani traces how Palestinian struggles for national liberation influenced Puerto Rican activists seeking independence from the United States. Nadim Bawalsa, writing in Nakla, digs even further. Drawing on newspapers published by Palestinian migrants in early 20th century Chile, he uncovers a fascinating story of how a community that self-identified as Pan-Arabic in Pan-Arabic terms came to see itself explicitly Palestinian, powerfully shaping what is by far the largest and most tightly organized community of Palestinian descendants in the Americas. Omar Tesdel, too, reads deep into the history of 20th century to uncover how Mexican and Palestinian agronomists sought to turn dry farming techniques into a political tool for land tenancy, development, and eventually national identity formation. Mexico also features in Marwan Kraidi's contribution, which examines the meanings of modernity in both regions through the lens of two prominent intellectuals who have shaped discourse and policy in the Americas and in Saudi Arabia, in particular with wider impact across the Middle East, Egypt in the Middle East. Egypt, too, is a key site for comparison for Paul Amar, whose explosive piece and contribution considers how the military in both countries, Egypt and Brazil, have increasingly encroached into the realm of capitalist development projects with striking and troubling trajectories in each region. Our third thematic area examines recent history in earnest. Here, contributors consider social movements, political, economic, and cultural exchanges, and transnational solidarity and diaspora politics in light of the Arab uprisings, against the backdrop of nearly 2 decades of left-wing governance in Latin America. So, writing in Nakla, Tarek Dana appraises factionalism within the Palestinian liberation movement, providing a crucial corrective to the surface level solidarity that has long informed Latin American views not only of Palestine, but of political movements in the Middle East more broadly, obscuring fraught internal dynamics. In Marib, Cecilia Baeza and Paulo Pinto shed light on the mobilization of Syrian diaspora populations through an examination of pro-Assad regime mobilization among the Syrian Lebanese community in Argentina. And Paulo Farah examines the rise and fall of the Arab Latin American Summit, ASPA, to shed light on the possibilities of state-led South-South solidarity. So these issues of Nakla Report and of Marib, along with the work that Rania Jawad and Amal Sheikh, Iman Morsi, Ali Mirsapasi, and Aran Keshavartian, my apologies, scholars of Middle East and Latin American politics and culture, who will offer commentary that will appear in yadalia.org at the conclusion of the conference, only scratch the surface of a rich and complex topic. Over the next 2 days, as we hear from our contributors, you will see these cross-cutting themes I've outlined here represented in the 4 panels grouped under 4 general areas: the politics of art, political parallels and economic intersections, mapping solidarities and confluences and cartographies. Again, I encourage you to read the assembled papers in the online and print issues of Nakla and Marib, as we fully anticipate that this collaboration will be a springboard for ongoing and deeper cross-regional understandings and solidarities. This conference and the work that it has already generated is only the beginning. Now that you have a sense of the scope and significance of this undertaking, you can better appreciate, as we do immensely, the support of our sponsors who have made the conference and the larger project of which it is a part possible: the NYU Gallatin School of Individualized Study and its Dean Suzanne Wofford and Associate Dean Mallory Paulinet, the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies and its Director Joe Lane and Associate Director Omar Duarje, the Haga Kevorkian Center for Near Eastern Studies and its Director Helga Suri, the NYU Center for the Humanities, the Urban Democracy Lab at NYU Gallatin, the Consejo Latinoamericano de Ciencias Sociales, and the Columbia University Global Centers. We're also deeply grateful to Sam Kellogg, Laura Wise, and Lauren Gurley at NACLA, to Belda Stefani and Isabel Hazel at CLACS, to Teresa Anderson, Rachel Plutzer, and Jennifer Burge at Gallatin, and to Greta Scharnweber at the Kevorkian Center for their tremendous logistical feat of collaboration across schools and departments and centers that has brought us all together here today and tomorrow. And finally, we are grateful for your attendance here in person. For those of you, we will have a hopefully live stream coming up soon. For those following on Twitter via the hashtag Latinese, so feel free to tweet. We invite all of you to participate actively by reading the various articles online and by chiming in with your comments and questions throughout these 2 days and throughout the various platforms that comprise it. Your engagement will ensure that we can harness the energy and excitement of this impressive gathering in order to imagine new opportunities for collaboration, research, and activism, and to shine an even brighter spotlight on the complex and fascinating work and web of intersections in the past, present, and future between Latin America and the Middle East. So again, on behalf of Omar and Sinan, thank you, gracias, obrigado, and shukran, and welcome. So we'll have the first panelist come up.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome. My name is Omar Dahi. I'm an associate professor of economics at Hampshire College and also a member of the editorial committee of the Middle East Research and Information Project, MERIP. And on behalf of MERIP, I would like to thank you all for coming. I'm very excited to be introducing our speakers, but before I do, I want to just take 60 seconds to thank you all for coming, to thank our speakers, and everyone who contributed with their essays and the discussants as well. This is a project that has been a long time in the making, at least a year and a half, since we've been talking about this and planning it, so we're very happy that it's come together. We're very proud of the work that has come so far, and we're really excited about the possibilities moving forward. So thank you all again. I also want to add my thanks to the sponsors who made this possible, and particularly thank Sinan and Alejandro as well for hosting us. So please give them all another round of applause. I'm going to introduce all our speakers, and then they'll go in the order that's in the program. I'll give you their abridged bios, and hopefully, for those of you who don't know them, you'll get to meet them in person and know a lot more about them throughout these 2 days. I'll go one by one. First speakers are Huzan Mahmoud and Ismail Hamalau. Huzan is a Kurdish writer and feminist with an MA in Gender Studies from SOAS, University of London, and is a co-founder of the Culture Project. Ismail Hamalau is a novelist, essayist, and co-founder of the Culture Project as well. Lina Miri is assistant professor of anthropology at Birzeit University. Her research focuses on revolutionary movements and revolutionary subject formation and has appeared in South Atlantic Quarterly, Journal of Palestine Studies, and the Journal of Community Psychology. Most recently, she co-edited Rethinking Gender in Revolutions and Resistance, Lessons from the Arab World with Zed Books. Rosbelinda Cardenas is assistant professor of anthropology and Latin American studies at Hampshire College. She received her PhD in cultural anthropology from the University of California, Santa Cruz, and her work has appeared in the Journal of Peasant Studies, Latin American and Caribbean Ethnic Studies, Black Social Movements in Latin America, and Tabula Rasa. Hiba Bouakar is assistant professor of architecture, planning, and preservation at Columbia University. Bouakar received her PhD in city and regional planning with an emphasis in global metropolitan studies from the University of California at Berkeley. Her forthcoming book, For the War Yet to Come, Planning Beirut's Peripheries, will be published by Stanford University Press in September 2018. Sinan Toon, of course, is the Iraqi writer, poet, and translator who teaches here at the Gallatin School of at NYU. He is also the culture editor at Jadaliya, author of novels The Corpse Watcher, The Baghdad Eucharist, and Ajam and Iraqi Rhapsody, which have been translated into multiple languages, as well as The Poetics of the Obscene in Pre-Modern Arabic Poetry. Rania Jawad is assistant professor and current chair of the Department of English Language and Literature at Birzeit University. She received her PhD from NYU in 2013, and her book project, The Art of the Real, considers the violence of settler colonialism in relation to constructions of the real in Palestine. Our discussant, Iman Mursi, is a literary scholar and assistant professor of Asian and Middle Eastern languages and literatures at Dartmouth, as well as comparative literature department. Her book manuscript, titled Let Them Eat Meat, Fidel Castro and Jamal Abdel Nasser's Dietary Utopias and Their Cultural Afterlives, should be out shortly. So thank you all, and thank you for our speakers.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm very delighted to be here, and thank you so much for the organizers for bringing us all together here, but particularly to Alejandro, who found us in London and told us to have a Kurdish perspective as well. So finally, Kurds exist in Middle East. You know, speaking about the Latin influence on Kurds, specifically from Iraqi Kurdistan, because, you know, again, it's so many Kurds all over the places. I can't really speak on behalf of them, and I will only speak on behalf of myself as a Kurdish woman feminist, as well as somebody who grew up in Iraqi Kurdistan, and how we were influenced by Latin American literature, leftist revolutionary icons, and movements as well. I mean, I grew up in an era in the history of Iraq whereby we grew up under the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein. I mean, he was terrible for the entire people who lived under his regime. Just maybe he was good for his supporters, so that's, you know, clear. But for the rest of the people who actually opposed dictatorship and authoritarianism, life was hell. And one of those people was me and my family. My family were Peshmerga fighters in the mountains. So whenever I go there, I see posters of Che Guevara, and who is this man? And I was only a child, and I got introduced to him and to the leftist ideals and to the Latin American revolutionary leftist movements, anti-imperialist movements as well. And then when I came to London and I lived there, after a while I got my passport, I decided to go to Cuba just to find out more about the influence of this man that I could see in my teenagehood and childhood as well. And I could really relate a lot of things through seeing his posters everywhere, speaking to people about the influence of this revolutionary person. And then, you know, the memory reconnects. But also after all these years, somebody like Alejandro, you know, we meet at somewhere, and then he says, why don't you guys write a joint or something about the influence of Latin America in Kurdistan? And I'm glad that we did. And I invite you to read our paper, because it's a lot, and there's a lot of issues. But I would like to focus mainly, I leave the magical realism stuff for my partner. You know, he's a novelist, the technicalities. But I would like to draw your attention to the similarities and to actually the connection between femicide, or the representation of female figure or protagonist in the Latin American literature, in somebody like Marquez and Roberto Bolaño and Isabel Allende and so many others, and also in Kurdish writers and poets, you know, writings, how the female figure is portrayed often as a victim of violence, on a killing, be it on a killing or femicide in the Latin American context, and lots of other forms of violence. But also there's these two main figures that you can always, you know, connect to. One is of an older woman, the kind of the symbol of wisdom, the symbol of purity, the symbol of somebody who keeps the family together, but also the symbol of a young, beautiful girl who's always, you know, blamed for, you know, bringing problems upon men and so on and so forth, you know, so the entire problem, you know, of masculinity and problems is actually blamed on the beautiful young girls in these literary representations. But also, you know, when you grow up in a society that has been, you know, driven into violence year after year, be it dictatorship, civil war, occupation, colonization, you know, you have violence internalized even within the confines of the homes as well. So this is what we can see in Latin American portrayal of women in the novels, or often in poetry, as a subject of love and passion and so on and so forth. One thing that really kind of interests me is also how there's so much representation of women in these literary works, but also often you see them as victims or as figures that so much expectation is placed on them. To basically, men are adventurers, they go out on business or they go out on political missions, they are you know, colonels and generals and you name it, but it's the women who keeps, you know, the family together, who basically clean the dirt, you know, afterward men are going out, you know, for adventures. And this is what you can see a lot as well in Kurdish literary productions. And I think, you know, there's a lot to be said about that, but as I said, I'll leave it for you to kind of go on it. But also the issue of femicide, you know, killing of women, as I said, under the name of so-called honor in our countries, and I think most of you know, Middle Eastern countries suffer from this epidemic, that women represent the symbol of honor or shame to be brought upon, you know, the honor of the family, and she is killed to basically clear that shame. And unfortunately, Kurdish society is not clear from that. It's also, you have female revolutionary fighters throughout Kurdish history, but you also have this internalized violence that women can actually be subjected to killings for simply falling in love or simply just having sex outside of marriage. So this is an epidemic, and it has been dealt with also in literature and poetry as well. And there's a lot of resistance to it, of course, in Kurdish diaspora as well as in Kurdistan in different parts as well. There are entire schools of thoughts about it now, and that women, even getting armed, for example, in the Rojava revolution, to actually not only fight the ISIS, which is symbolizing the ultimate patriarchy and misogyny and toxic masculinity, but also to actually support and themselves and to fight against gender apartheid and against female subjugation in Rojava. In Iraqi Kurdistan, it's very similar. Women have been mobilizing against that. They have used poetry, they have used cultural productions, art, literature, documentary films to actually, fight against that. So I could see there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot to actually learn from and to connect to. And that's why, a lot of Latin American writers and artists and singers are so popular in Iraqi Kurdistan. You could see their posters, their names everywhere, and I don't think that you will find somebody who haven't read Marquise. I don't think you will see an artist, male or female, who is not impressed by the rebellion of Frida Kahlo. You might, you will see and hear that in discussions everywhere you go in Kurdistan. And finally, I think, how many minutes I've got? 5 minutes. Finally, I would like to actually, he just told me 5 minutes left, yeah? Okay. So, another issue I would like to bring here is the issue about magical realism, although I said I'll let Ismail, but I'll speak a little bit of it myself as well. Why it made so much sense to us, because growing up, everyday life was different than the day before. You have war, you have to, the exodus, for example, the Kurdish exodus in 1991, 3 million left the cities, and then we speak about it in the paper as well, as if the city never existed and everybody was on the valleys and mountains and on the roads, and you see people killed, women giving birth, people fighting over food. You see all these kind of things, and when you tell it to people here, they think, is it a magic or is it a reality? So that's why, for us, really, magic and reality is the two sides of the same coin, and they could be almost similar. Because, or for example, look in Rojava, within a day and a night, Erdogan suddenly decides to invade Afrin because he thinks they are a threat to his empire, and entire lives are turned upside down. For example, people's freedom struggle is being, defeated, or militarily speaking. But in a revolutionary sense, it's always, Afrin is still, in my opinion, a symbol of resistance towards Turkish fascism and aggression on other people's cities that pose no problem to anybody. Or you have, for example, the latest, as Alejandro also speak about it, about our referendum in Iraqi Kurdistan, whereby just people peacefully said in one referendum that we want to have an independent Kurdistan, and suddenly the day after you have Al-Hashd al-Sha'bi, which is a notorious Shia militia funded and supported by Iran. I mean, they invade the city and they capture and they start to blow up people's houses and rape women and subjugate children to violence. And you see the entire cities again filled with violence and fascist remarks. And, if you see the videos they post so proud on the Facebook, you just wonder, what kind of century do we live in? Is it really medieval times, or is it 21st century, whereby, we have all these glamorous, cliches of human right and children's right and women's rights, but within a moment it all gone to the dustbin, basically. I mean, this is a country that, okay, if you believe in living together, why so much fascism? Why such a language of genocide? I mean, the language was used in the media, in the official media, was the language of genocide that we were subjected to under Saddam's regime. So this is why, for us, this kind of things is not magic. It's not imagination, it's not illusion. It's a real, actually, everyday happening. And this is what makes so much what is happening in the Latin American literature. For example, when you read Marquise, you think, oh, this might not exist. But actually, we have witnessed so much so much of this magical realism that it has almost become part of our lives. That's why when you read a novel from Latin American, for example, somebody like Roberto Bolaño, if you change the name and the characters to Kurdish names, it could be my city, for example. It could be any other place in Rojava on Kurdistan where you have, one invader comes, the other one goes. You have all these enemies for no reason, just for the simple fact that you are Kurdish, okay? Then you are born as Kurdish, so, So it's interesting how much being Kurdish carries in terms of genocide, in terms of threat, in terms of hatred, in terms of, and you could see, like, even I hated Facebook because you could see so many people that ones you worked with, because I've always also supported progressive movements in Iraq, women's rights movement, working class movement in Iraq. I supported them all the time. I still do, and I have very good friends in the Iraqi scene. I mean, even if we separate, that doesn't mean we have to become enemies. But the language that was used even by people who were my friends yesterday, unfortunately, it was very racistic, and it was beyond that imagination that could really, one can imagine from educated, intellectual elitists who speak with the language of human rights and sovereignty and freedom, but actually when it comes to your right, zero, you don't exist. So, we have an existence, but also we don't exist. So this is probably my magical realism. And I will end on that note just to say, please read our paper, and I'm happy to respond to any questions. I have to stop now so that my partner Ismail can speak about other issues as well. Thank you so much for giving us the platform. Thank you.
Wow. You are a good speaker, Okay, I'm belonging to the writer, to the generation, the Kurdish generation, 80s generation. They call it 80s generation, and I think most of us, maybe the Kurdish writer more than the Iraqi writer. This term of the Iraqi writer, what's the Iraqi? There is no term of the Iraqi writer, because if you say the Iraqi writer in Iraq, this is Arabic language writer. Okay, the Kurdish writer, they understand, for example, the figure of the General Jose Arcadio Buendia, his laziness, he's belonging to, he's going to his work place, and he make a small fish, and suddenly he want to change something, and he go to start a new war. Okay, we as Kurdish, the 80s generation, we wasn't obsessed with this Kurdish nationalistic ideas that the literature should represent only the fight between the groups, the holder of the nation. No, there was many things happened after 1958. Iraq turned to the some kind of the disaster. There was, every time there was a general come in the power and change something, okay, and the Kurdish movement change their ideas, and character, and how can the literature, and in 80s, how can the literature represent all this changing? It's not changing in about okay, 1 minute. Okay. 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 Everything is happening. For example, you mentioned that. For example, in 1991, our big exodus. Because I was a Peshmerga at that time, so where we turned in 2 or 3 hours, the city was empty. As you can imagine yourself, okay, you are in film, Okay, you are in a hotel, and after that, okay, there's nobody on the street. The city is empty. All this imagination, the Latin American novelists, they offer us this technique. The technique is not realistic, but it is realistic. How we can join the imaginary, the imagination of the pupil with the imagination of the history. We have two kind of there's the, for example, I give you only one example. We were Peshmerga, and against the Saddam Hussein regime and middle 80s. Okay, there was a ant, we called it ant, the big ant, and if she said, oh, please don't go to this fight in the next week, please don't go there to this area, we said okay, because our aunt had she had a vision, and this vision impact our Peshmerga. So, for example, I was one of the political leader. I couldn't convince my Peshmerga, my fighter, this is not real, and they refused to come with us. Said no, because the aunt said it is something like that. This kind of the figure, we see that in for example, Amaranta in 100 of Solitude, we see the Orzola, and this similarity between the imagination and the reality is impact us and give us the technique to write. I shall stop now, because if you want to speak about that, we have another. Okay, thank you very much.
Good morning. Okay, so my essay in the report focuses on the experience of reading revolutionary texts and testimonies by Palestinian students at Birzeit University. For me, what interested me is to try to understand what is the relevance of revolutionary texts for Palestinian present-day politics. So I'll start with the current day situation in Palestine and for Palestinians, and then go back to the 60s and 70s in order to come back to the present and to read the future of this present. So if we think about present day, current day politics in Palestine, first, Palestinian and Palestinians are still subject to the continuing expansion of the Zionist settler colonial project in Palestine. The Zionist settler colonial project aims at dispossessing Palestinian lands, eliminating the Palestinians, and through different means. But we can see the killing today in Gaza, we can see the mass incarceration of Palestinians, we can see the confiscation of lands, through different means, including the violence of the law. So this is the current situation for Palestinians. On the other hand, we see that the Palestinian Authority, established after the Oslo agreements in 1993, had adopted a formal political project that is titled Building State Institutions. Of course, building state institutions according to the liberal logic and the neoliberal rationality, seeking the recognition of the international community. In this case, it's the Americans and the Europeans, and cooperating with the Israeli colonizers in what had been constituted after Oslo as the security cooperation. So that's all of this amidst the continuation and expansion of the Zionist settler colonial project. In this context, large segments of the Palestinian society, and specifically Palestinian youth, are feeling alienated from the Palestinian formal politics. And they are aware of the close affinity of the Palestinian authorities, developmental plans, and policies with the colonial condition, with the continuation of the colonial condition. So for Palestinians, for youth, it seems that in today's reality, there's no referential frame for thinking about revolutionary politics. It's like there's no referential frame and conceptions to try to think of a different or an alternative political praxis. And here comes the reading of revolutionary texts and its impact. So in this context, lots of students at the university and also outside the academia are immersing themselves in reading and discussing revolutionary texts, including revolutionary texts from Latin America. And it seems that the role that these texts play today is activating the political imagination of the readers and cultivating a space for liberational politics that is different than the current day or the confines of current day liberal forms of politics. But then, when students started reading these texts, it seemed that they were not also aware that during the 60s and the 70s, the circulation of Latin American texts, and not just the texts, but also of revolutionaries themselves across the Palestinian and the Latin American revolutionary movements. And here, we know that during the 60s and the 70s, activists from the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and specifically activists who were affiliated with the leftist organizations, had translated Latin American revolutionary texts and read them very carefully. And also in prison walls, Latin American revolutionary texts were distributed, read, and discussed by Palestinian prisoners. Further, as I said, like the connections between Latin American revolutionary movements and the Palestinian revolution had also included the engagement of Latin American revolutionaries in the Palestinian cause, like Patrick Arguello, who joined Layla Khaled in 1970 in hijacking the Israeli airplane, and many others like Carlos, who Tariq mentions also in his text. And we have a very close connection with the Sandinista movement, where Palestinian strugglers were trained in Nicaragua. We have of course, the support and from the Cuban regime, and specifically here, we remember the 1966 Cuban sponsored the Tricontinental Conference, in which the Palestinian cause was in the center of the conference. So we can say that the node of connection between the Latin American and the Palestinian revolution was specifically on the ground of opposing imperialism, and specifically when Palestine and the Palestinian cause was perceived as an anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, struggle. And this was the node of the connection with the Latin American and other third world revolutionary movements. But specifically, like Palestinian translated during the 60s, 70s, and the 80s, Palestinians translated Latin American revolutionary texts and read them in order to draw connection, in order also to use and learn from the experiences of the revolutionary movements. For example, Palestinians, including Palestinians in prisons, had translated and read very deeply the experience of the Tupamaros in Uruguay. And specifically, they wanted to draw the lessons because the Tupamaros was a revolutionary movement in an urban setting. And they draw a lot of lessons from how to learn about secrecy, underground activities within urban settings, which was very important for the Palestinian experience. So activists, Palestinian activists and strugglers draw lessons from the experience of Latin American Revolution, but at the same time they were very attentive to what tactics can be applicable in the Palestinian context and what tactics cannot be applicable. And of course, for prisoners, the main goal was to, the main goal was like first reading these texts aimed to take from these experiences, but also to draw inspiration in knowing that there are people all over the world who are struggling against injustice. And for Palestinian prisoners, this was very important for their own sumud and struggle. And at the end, if we come back to the present days, like with the hegemony of the realistic politics, the hegemony of liberal sensitivities, self-interest, and the whole current political situation, reading these revolutionary texts constitute a referential frame for an alternative way of politics, radical conceptions and subjectivities, and a revolutionary hope and conviction for Palestinians, and specifically for the Palestinian youth, that liberation is possible and that social justice is possible. So that's why the reading now of these texts had been an interesting experience for Palestinian students.
Good morning. Can you hear me? Is this on? Okay. All right. So we're going to try to do a very quick abridged version to narrate a collaboration between Hiba and myself, teaching a course on contemporary politics in the Middle East and Latin America, which we taught in 2015 at Hampshire College. So although we cannot quite pinpoint where the idea began, what followed after we made the decision was basically an idea, a sense of excitement and emergent possibility. Just to give you a sense of the kinds of things that we discussed, after looking at some of the shared literature and each of the topics that we were each familiar with, in the classroom we talked, for instance, about the state's role in gendering, as people in the informal sector stake their claims to livelihoods in places as seemingly different as Egypt and the Dominican Republic. We thought through racially contested geographies in Brazil, side by side, resistance against the separation wall in Israel and Palestine. We reflected jointly on the oil modernities of Dubai and Venezuela and discussed the aftermaths of the pink tide in Latin America and of the Arab Spring in the Middle East. But as we started to pull out these very promising lines of connection in the classroom, actually before we entered the classroom, we had to confront the realization that many of them were framed in experiences of violence. And as I hear some of the panelists today, this is, it reinforces the sense that we had when we started drafting the syllabus. So suddenly the syllabus began to read like a list of nightmares, dystopias, right? Devastated landscapes, persistent forms of gendered subjugation, ever more exploitative labor regimes, voracious resource extraction, and seemingly endless cycles of war. So suddenly our excitement turned into somber reflection. And although we still had a sense of anticipation, we also came into the classroom with a sense of urgency. The classroom was a very interesting experience, and this is a little bit of what we want to share with you today, which is what we have brought out of the experience, not only of teaching, but then of reflecting on the teaching and what came out of it later. But in the classroom, the students had a rare opportunity to go into dialogues across disciplines and across regions, students that don't often work together. We brought some photos of some of the posters of their final presentations that included things like political graffiti and street art in Beirut and Bogota, drug wars in Mexico and Afghanistan, education among Palestinian and Colombian refugees, the tactics of Zapatista and Kurdish women's resistance movements, diasporic influences of popular music in both regions, among many other projects. So, however, in addition to what happened within the classroom, there was a generative effect after that. And the pedagogical experiment afforded us, too, a very unique space where we could have not only South-South conversations, but I think also a feminist intervention into pedagogy, beyond the Eurocentric gaze about the places that we call home. So, while the focus on violence initially cast a shadow on our syllabus, in the end it allowed us to engage in a critical self-reflection about our own research and writing. And if violence is pervasive in our field sites, we figured, and in our homes, then violence is what we had to wrestle with. So this is where we want to speak from today, and we will very, very briefly reflect on some of the challenges that we face and that we came to an awareness of in talking to each other and in being in the classroom. And the difficulty about writing about violence that is intimate, on the difficulty of interrogating the separation between victims and victimizers, experts and subjects, in times of violence and times of peace. So this is what we very briefly want to share with you today. I won't go into a lot of detail, but what I write about in the article is the difficulty of publishing an article about internally displaced people in Bogota from the Pacific coast of Colombia. The only thing that I will briefly comment on here is that when I received the reviewers' comments, they were very contrasting. So on the one hand, I had one reviewer that loved the piece, and on the other hand, I had a reviewer that had a very strong reaction against it and was basically concerned about the ethics of writing about remaking lives after violence. In the conversations that I had with Hiba, both inside the classroom and after in coming up with this piece, I have collected just 2 lessons that I want to share with you today about the process of writing about violence. And those are the 2 things that I want to share with you today. The first one is that we must constantly define what we mean by violence. And this means constantly challenging dominant definitions which tend to recognize it when it's manifested mostly in spectacular encounters rather than its quotidian and structural forms, because these dominant definitions render victims invisible. In the Colombian case, for example, which is the one I write about, the state-sanctioned definition of violence identifies as victims only those who have experienced loss during the years demarcated by the Civil War and by a specific set of victimizers, like paramilitaries and guerrilleros. And this definition fails to show how the lives of many are enmeshed with and exacerbated by everyday forms of living in violence. And this is also something that I gathered from the opportunity of commenting on a set of writings of women on Arab women's interventions in writing and ethnography and producing knowledge. So this definition, for instance, fails to recognize Margarita, right? a woman, a black domestic worker from the rural Pacific who has lived in extreme poverty her entire life and recently lost a son to street violence in Bogota as a victim. This failure is due to the fact that the tools that we have to identify and name violence disregard structural forces such as poverty, patriarchy, and racism in their deadly intersections with war. The second lesson, which I will share with you in 1 minute, is that we urgently need representations that explore multiple uses of and responses to violence. And this is very tricky ground. This insight is something that I've gathered mostly from my interlocutors and in these conversations across regions, but basically to get to the conclusion that looking closely and intimately at the lives of people living in seemingly perpetual violence reveals a lot more than destruction and rupture. I think I will leave it there.
So in these conversations, I was reflecting on my work on Beirut. And so my work on Beirut for the last decade has aimed to expose the forms of violence that people endure in post-conflict geographies where the future is imagined to consist of war more than that of peace. Beirut is also my home city. My family and I were displaced many times over the course of the Lebanese civil war. And while I write from New York, the violence of Beirut's post-conflict geographies that affects my loved ones is still very personal. Doing this kind of work, I often found myself asking, so what is my purpose and what are the ethics of writing academically about violence that has been so intimate to my life? It has become a process of learning how to walk the tightropes that define the contours of my scholarly, political, and personal engagements with these sites. In my forthcoming book, For the War Yet to Come, on planning Beirut's frontiers, I include an autoethnographic account of my family's life in an apartment building in a southeastern periphery of Beirut. In 2009-2010, I was doing field research on the urbanization frenzy that was taking place in Beirut's southern peripheries only a year after Beirut had witnessed battles that reminded everyone of the civil war. At the time, a contestation evolved surrounding the construction of a neighboring building that was illegally encroaching on the shared amenities of the neighborhood. In Lebanon, usually the enforcement of the law, the building law, and all law, is quite uneven. So, so basically, challenging the illegal extensions of the building next door became a political process divided along sectarian lines. As parties became involved, the people who resisted the illegal construction, including my family, received threats. Eventually, the illegalities were removed, only because at the moment, the political scale in the neighborhood tipped in favor of the religious political organization that was in favor of removing them. Witnessing the negotiations and threats as they unfolded from my family's living room, I was convinced that an autoethnographic account of this contestation could astutely illustrate the capillaries of power that have transformed Beirut's peripheries into frontiers of urban growth and violence, which is the subject of my research. However, when I started jotting my account down on paper, I became anxious about describing these everyday forms of contestation that might compromise my family's safety in the future. This worry is neither unfounded nor realistic. For people who are familiar with Lebanon, people are always worried about this. So my family and other families had to leave their apartments in the battles of 2008, and their IDs were being checked, actions reminiscent of the Civil War when people were killed based on the religion that was put on their IDs. And so the ghosts of such past experiences cast a large shadow every time violence erupts. And every time I tried to write on how to make visible the violence of urbanization and how to articulate people's dispossession while editing out the stories that could subject them to new rounds of displacement. Over the years, I came to realize that in the violence and study, and this is also in conversation with Rose, there are no winners and losers, and the lines between aggressors and victims are often blurry. The tables keep turning. One day an aggressor, the other day a victim. Anyways, this process of producing knowledge on violence from within is also shaped by challenges of presenting such work in the public sphere, especially after people talk about their experiences in the Civil War 28 years afterwards, but with having lost their homes or with their amputated bodies and stuff like that. So how to talk about this violence in the public sphere is a challenge, both at home and within the larger academic community. In 2010, when I first presented my work in Beirut, I was actually overtaken with anxiety about how it was going to be received. There, I was standing in front of a packed auditorium to speak about the territorial contestation between the Shia Hezbollah and the Druze Progressive Socialist Party, a topic that everyone in the room has a very strong opinion about. The country was still recovering from the 2008 battles between the two groups, and given my family's origin, I was nervous that someone in the audience would accuse me of being against Hezbollah, or that I would be denounced for not being sympathetic to my own people, a minority religious group of the Middle East. So speaking in a world shaped by dominant narratives of the war on terror, I'd had similar worries presenting my work for an academic audience, where many in the audience know Hezbollah by its Western reductionist label as terrorist organization. However, actually writing from within Beirut and being truthful to my interlocutors involved discussing Hezbollah as just another Lebanese actor representative of a large section of the Lebanese population. So as I navigated these feelings, the process of writing about violence from within has become a project that folds within it the local and global anxieties about places that have been always labeled as dangerous, but that are within their histories of violence a home to many, a thing we both struggle with. Anyway, so in that process of writing, we have sought to invert the scholarly gaze from the North by speaking back to it, questioning its assumptions and enumerating its limits. We have tried to make visible the intellectual and emotional labor that it takes to write about violence from within, and to remain truthful to the sites and people while addressing audiences often far removed from these settings. It's important to reiterate that this South intellectual engagement actually started as a pedagogical exercise. The classroom provided us with an opportunity to carve out a space to interrogate the knowledge produced about Latin America from the prism of the Middle East and vice versa. This method proved productive for imagining different futures in a moment where the horizon of progressive politics seems to be foreclosing around the globe. Such pedagogical approaches are central to decentering hegemonic knowledge production and generating different approaches to understanding the world. Like the rest of the presenters here today, we strongly believe that these kinds of experiences should be encouraged and become more common, not only for epistemological reasons, but to better respond to the political urgency of our historical moment. Thank you.
Thank you. I was going to talk briefly about the paper that I did not write. No, but growing up in Iraq under Saddam Hussein's dictatorship in the 80s with severe censorship, actually, the literature translated from Latin America was very important on many levels, not only for those of us who are writers, but to kind of be able to read about other military dictatorships and all of that. So it was kind of political porn. So I wanted to write a paper about the huge influence of Latin American literature on myself as a writer, but I'll leave that. My paper today is about a poem written by an Iraqi poet who's my current book, and work in progress, a very important pioneering poet, Sargon Bolos, who was born in Iraq in 1944 and left in 1967 to Beirut, lived there for 2 years, but then came to California, and he's an important pioneering poet, but he's under-researched and also misread in that the great majority of reading, for a variety of reasons I cannot go into, strip him or completely depoliticize him. And in his last posthumous collection, there is a poem dedicated to the Peruvian poet Cesar Vallejo. So the paper is just about that poem, but through the poem and reading the poem, I speculate on why Vallejo becomes such an important figure for Bolos later in his career. It's because, in a way, also Bolos's trajectory is very unique in that many, or the great majority of the major poets in the Arab world start out in a way as members of powerful political parties, and many of them started out as engaged or very politicized poets, but in the 80s or later ended up kind of on more liberal grounds. Bolos is the exact opposite, because he starts out being very influenced by the Shia movement in Beirut and kind of taking a stance against any type of organized politics, and he's very enamored with America, with America's culture, and influenced by the Beat generation. He translates them into Arabic. But as I say in the paper, it seems that in the 80s particularly, but also specifically after the 91 Gulf War, he has a major disenchantment with the idea of America and becomes a more political poet, for lack of other words. So I'll just read briefly parts about the poem and about the parallels between the two poets. And the subtitle of the paper is On Poetic Affinity and Solidarity. Needless to say, there is some work, of course, on the influence and the cultural dialogues, but it's always on the other major poets, Neruda and others, and there's very little, to my knowledge, about Vallejo, and Bolos is the first one to actively engage with him. And also, oftentimes, the focus is also on, of course, European influence, Auden and others, and so that's why I was very happy when Alejandro and Omar talked about this conference as an opportunity to take it in a different direction. So there are parallels in the lives of the two poets. Both lived most of their lives in exile and died far away from their homelands. Vallejo left Peru to Paris in 1923 and died there in 1938, 6 years before Bolos was born in Iraq. Bolos left early on in '67 and lived the rest of his life in exile too, mostly in San Francisco, and died in Berlin in 2007. Both lived in cosmopolitan cultural centers, but remained largely at the margins. Neither of the two made peace with his exile, and they both maintained a sense of linguistic and cultural dislocation and continue to write in their native language. Their engagement with and attitude towards organized politics, however, was quite different. Vallejo's politics were outspoken and radical. In the 1920s, he embraced communism, visited the USSR 3 times. He wrote articles and chronicles about his visits, expressing his admiration of the Soviet experiment. He joined the Spanish Communist Party in 1931. The Spanish Civil War had a profound effect on his politics and his late poetry. Like the Chilean poet Pablo Neruda, he was a member of the French section of the Committee for the Defense of the Republic and a delegate of the Second International Association of Writers in Defense of Culture in Valencia, summer of '37. He went to Spain twice, reported on the war, and saw its horrors. His involvement in the Spanish Civil War ended in deep despair with the defeat of the popular revolution at the hands of the communists. The former held the greatest emancipatory potential for Vallejo, who had sympathies for Trotskyism. Bolos never joined any party or political movement. When he was still a young poet in Iraq, communism was very attractive, and the Iraqi Communist Party enjoyed wide support and popularity. He, however, was disinterested in organized politics. Throughout the 70s and 80s, when he lived in San Francisco, after a brief stay in Beirut, he led a bohemian life and was still enchanted by the individual freedom America offered him. The first Gulf War and the US bombing of Iraq in 1991 marked the beginning of a bitter disenchantment. Quote, "It was a bloodied mirror. America had nothing more to offer as far as I was concerned," he wrote. He was further alienated and angered by the 2003 US invasion of Iraq and its aftermath. It had a profound influence on his later writing. His late poems reveal a sustained engagement with visceral political themes. The voices and ghosts of the victims of wars and global exploitation intermingle and become more prominent. The subjects of his poems are alienated and exploited humans struggling against the barbarism of history and a global economy of greed. In this, Vallejo and his poetry might have been an inspiration. I'm not going to read the poem, which is entitled To Cesar Vallejo and appropriates lines from a very famous poem by Vallejo, because there is no time. But the central line is Cesar Vallejo, I am the one shouting this time. The poem is prefaced with 3 lines excerpted from a famous poem, The Hungry Man's Wheel, one of the Vallejo poems which Bolos translated to Arabic via English. The poem begins with Bolos addressing Vallejo directly in the first line, Cesar Vallejo, I am the one shouting this time. This sentence is repeated again at the very end of the poem. The act of shouting is being repeated here by another poet in a different era. This time today, he says. Has Bolos too arrived at the same existential and political coordinates from which Vallejo raised his voice? The next 2 lines tell the reader more about what sort of shouting and to what end. Quote, allow me to open my mouth and protest, the blood rising in the thermometer, pushing back Mercury's banner. Even without the reader knowing much about Vallejo's politics, the telos of this shouting is explicitly defined as a protest. And this protest is almost natural, since it follows as soon as the poetic persona opens his mouth. The poem itself is the extension of the shout. It is spontaneous and urgent, and directed against the overwhelming presence of blood. One is reminded of Neruda's famous lines from I'm Explaining a Few Things, which was also written during the Spanish Civil War. The line, come and see the blood in the streets. While war, a prominent theme in Bolus's late poetry, is not explicitly mentioned in this poem, a dead soldier does appear in the next section. Quote, the world's metaphysics are dragged down to the bottom of the empty boots of a soldier who was killed by his own crooked bayonet. These lines are followed by another direct reference to the title of Vallejo's poem, The Hungry Man's Wheel is Still Rolling. Who will stop it? Bolus then affirms the act of reading Vallejo. The time of the reading is significant. He says, I read you on the dreariest nights, and so are the effects of the reading. He says, the family's bandages were undone. So the act of reading is not neutral and does not only produce meanings, its effects are felt on the body itself. It exposes wounds and makes suffering explicit and unmediated. The theme of wounded and damaged bodies continues in the next section. I read your restless storms, where the sick man on the road of sorrows leans on the cane of the blind man who saw. Then Bolus addresses Vallejo directly again in a section that speaks of endings and death. Quote, alphabets rise and fall, the building collapses. The poem extinguishes its stars atop the head of the dead man crowned with thorns. The link between poetry and the body is asserted again. Dead man here appears to be a reference to Vallejo. The following line we read, something will drag our bodies on its stone course. The hour here may refer to the two bodies of Vallejo and Bolus, who are now joined in the poem. The last two lines of the poem refer to Vallejo's death and reference one of his poems in which he foresaw his own death. Vallejo here, there is a stone on which the black and white poet will sit this Thursday, and today I am the one shouting. This homage poem may be read as a site of solidarity and affinity between the two poets. Within the space of the poem, Bolus converses with Vallejo and claims him as a poetic comrade and ancestor, appropriates and echoes his protest, and inherits and inhabits his subject position. The Vallejo poems which Bolus translated and to which he refers in the homage poem, primarily The Hungry Man's Wheel, belong to a group of late poems in which Vallejo's concern transcends class to express solidarity with the species as a whole. This tendency can be found in many of Bolus's late poems. It has been remarked as well that there is a gradual shift in Vallejo's poetry from an earlier concern with writing avant-garde poetry to a pronounced focus on the political, but without falling into the traps of facile podium poetry. There is a similar shift in Bolus's trajectory, who early on was obsessed with the search of new forms and a radically different poetic language. But he ended up in a way on the same political and poetic terrain of Vallejo. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. As Sinan said, I will actually speak about a paper that I did not yet write. And I'll just offer some sketches to contribute to the conversation. As our panel has looked at encounters of reading and writing, the circulation of revolutionary figures and of texts, I want to address also the travel of methods or techniques, particularly a practice called theater of the oppressed that was originally devised in Latin America by the Brazilian theater practitioner and theorist Augusto Boal in the early 70s, with aims of revolutionary change that became used systematically by a number of Palestinian theater artists about 20 years following. Boal developed his praxis within the Marxist and anti-imperial movements of the era. He drew on the work of fellow Brazilian Paulo Freire's critical pedagogy to devise theater methods and exercises that arose from his work in oppressed communities. In brief, the theater space is used as a forum to investigate and rehearse ways to alter the power relations in our lives. Audience members enter the stage and experience and strategize how methods of resistance may play out. The rehearsal for the revolution, as Boal called it, is meant to leave us unsatisfied. There can be no catharsis inside the theater. We must take our action outside. Most often, the story of Boal's praxis in Palestine is told with a focus on the power of theater of the oppressed and its capabilities, whereas even in what's termed the entrenched conflict zone of Palestine and Israel, the praxis of this theater is still pertinent. Or the story reaffirms Palestinian cultural practices as modes of resistance to Israeli occupation and colonization, with little reference to Boal and his Latin American context. Less is the story told focused on the means by which Palestinian theater artists encountered, trained in, and became trainers of theater of the oppressed techniques, or potential parallels that can be made between artists situated in anti-imperial and anti-colonial contexts, such as the work of the Syrian playwright Saadallah Wannous, who wrote a short play in the late 1960s that could serve as a lucid articulation of what Boal later developed as his own praxis. In thinking about how South-South relationships evolve, in the case of theater oppressed, the relationships are not direct, exclusively or linearly built, and also are not always centered in the South. Most Palestinians' encounters with theater of the oppressed are entwined with European artists and are funded by US and European foundations. It was only later that more direct links were built with Boal himself and main members of his troupe in Rio de Janeiro. Two of Boal's books were subsequently translated into Arabic by Palestinians, one with the support of the Brazilian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and distributed locally and regionally in areas where Palestinian artists themselves have conducted trainings of theater of the oppressed, such as in Sudan, Yemen, and Iraq. In the settler colonial context of Palestine in the post-Oslo era, Boal's techniques are used by Palestinian theater artists, by Israeli groups, and also at times by groups of Palestinians and Israelis that are brought together either by North American or by Israeli artists. The South and North are not discrete entities bounded in themselves, which is very clear in our settler colonial context. And so to think about a leftist cultural practice developed in South America being used in Palestine is also to think about the multiple trajectories and routes of travel, which condition in ways how the methods are being practiced, who the individuals are that travel, what are the texts that are being translated, and who is investing in such work. As Boal acknowledged, theater of the press is not a revolutionary practice in itself, although it could be. The first systematic theater of the press work being done by Palestinian artists in the West Bank was funded by US aid, and external evaluations have been conducted by funding agencies to trace what they call the effectiveness of theater of the press methods in Palestinian society. Palestinian artists are aware of the power relations of institutionalization and funding as they perform their work in such a system. A pertinent example is a 2011 theater production that was based on a theater of the press model called Forum Theater. The play, which was funded by the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, in turn addressed the ways that local infrastructure, basic services, as well as cultural production in Palestine have become dependent on foreign funding and the attendant need of proposal writing. So they rehearsed this idea within the theater itself and tried to strategize methods to address it. A few months ago in Palestine, I spoke with Barbara Santos, who worked with Boal's troupe in Rio for a number of years and has been coming to Palestine since 2003 to train and work with Palestinian artists, largely to counter the dependency that she was seeing about Palestinians connecting to Boal's work through Europeans. She explained back home that theater of the press was continually developing and devising new methods of working. At its core, she said, is an element of never being satisfied. There's the need to constantly reevaluate and adjust methods. She noted that in Europe and elsewhere, she found groups practicing the same method over the years. One could say being loyal to Boal's method, but not necessarily his praxis. In contrast, according to Santos, Boal and his troupe had the liberty to depart and rethink the techniques with the aims of interrogating and transgressing the dynamics of power relations. Boal's call early on when devising theater of the press was to decolonize the theater, in part from the roles that we play that have become mechanized, the borders that we live by that have been defined by forces to subjugate us. We can still take heed of Boal's call, and as Lena said, with texts on liberation, to inspire strategies to not be satisfied with the power of performance. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for these really thoughtful papers. I have a lot of questions, but I also believe that I should open it up to the audience. So I'll focus on the questions that have more to do with the Latin East framework. I was thinking, well, in Ismail, Hussan, and Lina's papers, you guys trace transnational solidarity frameworks. And I guess this also applies to all the other papers. There was a question that kept popping up. What makes Latin America unique? Because there were many moments in many of your papers where you pointed to the fact that other contexts other than Latin America were involved in this transnational solidarity framework. Or in the case of Lina's paper, Lina, you met one of the people that you interviewed mentions that even though they were fascinated with Che Guevara, his case was not applicable to the Palestinian case, right? So, what makes it different from Vietnam or Congo or any other location, South Africa? With Hiba and Ruz Belinda's paper, I really love the South-South conversation and the collaborative generative outcome there. I just had a question about the label itself, and this is coming from someone who just co-founded a South-South forum. But you talk about avoiding triangulations with the North, right? Yeah, and that was mentioned. And the irony of doing a South-South forum, for instance, in my case, in the North. But there's another issue with that label. It's a label that, in many ways, the more I think about it, the more I feel like it reiterates a relational identity, one where there is a dominant, economically and militarily dominant North, and then there's a South vis-a-vis that. And at some point, you guys also point to that in your paper, you talk about this essay inverts the scholarly gaze from the North by speaking back to it. But isn't the point of a South-South to engage in a very different set of questions versus speaking back to the North, which in some ways was a project of dismantling of that power relations happened through post-colonial studies, right? And has been happening for a while. And then, Sinan, I guess the question I have is one of this, you're pointing out to a genealogy that I've also kind of tried to work with, a different kind of genealogy, one where artists and poets from the Middle East think of other influences and point to other influences. And I don't have an answer for this, but I'm wondering about what is the significance of creating such a genealogy, especially with Latin America, right? And then the other issue is the problems that come with the mediation through translation, which also bring up the issue of the North, because a lot of Latin American texts that are consumed in the Middle East are consumed through English and French, not through Spanish. I'll stop there. I have a ton of questions, but I'll stop there. Oh, and Rania, I guess I should say that I really loved the critique and several of the points that you raised with Theater of the Oppressed. Okay, I'll stop there. It's open to everyone.
Okay, so thank you so much. What I wanted to say briefly earlier is so difficult to talk about it in a way, because the irony is that's why I focused on the 80s. This will answer your question, hopefully, or try. In the 80s, it was very bizarre because there's the Iraqi state is in control, total control of cultural production and other facets of Iraqi society. And also there's a lot of funding for translation, and a lot of books are translated from South American literature. And many of them were about military dictatorships, as I said. So in that point, that was a very important, some of them were translated, many of them were translated directly from Spanish. But also coming from that part, I think, you know, in America, some of our colleagues and friends are surprised, especially when we early arrive. I remember I arrived in 1992, and people that I talked to were shocked that I had already read Italo Calvino in Arabic. But because coming from the margins, we have to know about everything, about all centers. So for, I guess, as a writer, in a way, this went without saying that, of course, while Europe and North America was central, but Latin America, especially in the 80s, Latin American literature was, you know, a very important stop. Actually now, and this is an aside, but now it's become a problem because so many novelists are still emulating Marquez and others. It's overdone. So the problem of the translation is, yes, I mean, I don't read Spanish, unfortunately, but Bolos doesn't read Spanish either. And although I'm generally uncomfortable about translations from second and third languages, but he had a project, I didn't have time to mention it. He's probably the most prolific translator in recent times, because he translated from, he was really interested in world literature and with a kind of a critical stance, but he was obviously influenced by what was being published in this country, whether by New Directions and in California. So it's unavoidable, but for me, the importance is that so much is written about Sargon Bolos, but most people have this image from 25 years ago. And there is so much focus, whether it's laziness or it's some kind of internalized Eurocentrism, where we keep talking about how he's influenced by Ginsberg and by the Beat generation. Then you read his poetry and you read the interviews, and he says, I am not influenced by the Beat generation. And for me, it's the politics, and especially in the last 15 years, I think and he tries to go out, it's not only Vallejo, so it's significant that in the last poetry collection, he dedicates a poem to Tu Fu, the Chinese poet. So he's really trying, despite everything, to really try to get out of this focus on Western Europe and North America. But I think there is another dimension that I want to explore, that I think for Bolos also, Vallejo was a very interesting figure in terms of working with being partly indigenous, and in a way, Bolos himself was half Assyrian and half Chaldean, and this is another way that he is misread. He is labeled as the Assyrian poet, even though, you know, he doesn't believe in Assyrian nationalism. He is anti-nationalist. So I think he is fascinated by Vallejo, because Vallejo also, coming from South America and living in Paris at the time, just as Bolos was living in San Francisco at the height of San Francisco poetry, that I think he admired the way Vallejo maintained a certain critical distance from Paris itself, and also a healthier relationship to what it means to be of an indigenous background, and how to write about the complicated history of one's country from an anti-colonial perspective.
Sure. Okay, no problem. Well, about your question about solidarities, of course, I mean, in the case of Kurdistan or Kurdish people, I mean, there has always been influences, be it from the region itself, from Arabic or Persian or even Turkish. So there's a lot of overlaps and influences, even politically speaking. So many of us, at least myself, I was in a leftist political party which was struggling for the entire liberation of Iraq, for example. So, but I resigned later on. That's a long story. So, you know, there has been a lot of, I mean, one aspect of Kurdish people is like their internationalism and solidarity as well. But lately also from Latin America, there has been a lot of solidarity towards Kurdistan. I mean, especially with the Rojava, with the women Peshmerga fighters in Brazil and Venezuela and Cuba and Argentina and Chile. There has been a lot of solidarity projects and supports and demonstrations. I mean, for Afrin, you could see, you know, a lot of pictures was published on the Facebook and the Kurdish media about the solidarity demonstrations and seminars, and lots of, you know, there's a lot of interaction now, politically speaking, really, between Kurdistan and Latin America. And lately, I mean, now they have translated a lot of texts from Kurdish women, and for example, Abdullah Öcalan, that inspired the Rojava Revolution. I mean, they also find similarities between the Kurdish struggle in the Middle East, as well as what is going on in Latin America. So these are also new developments, I must add. But also we don't close doors. We are some of us speak 3 languages, at least Kurdish, Arabic, and Farsi and Turkish, just because of the assimilation as well. We have many writers who already write in Arabic or Farsi or Turkish because they never had the chance to learn Kurdish. My generation had the chance. I learned Kurdish to read and write, but the generation before me, they didn't have that chance. So they had, like Salim Barakat, I'm sure you know him, he's Kurdish from Syria. He's a great novelist and poet. He writes in Arabic. You have Yashar Kamal. He writes entirely in Turkish, and he is Kurdish because he was never allowed to learn Kurdish. So there is really, we are spread and melted and assimilated, but yet we survive. And then, there is a lot to do for the greater humanity than just really nationalistic and so on. My defense of Kurdish independence or Kurdish struggle is really to avoid genocides and killings and hatred between. I've never wanted to see hatred between Arabs or Kurds or Turks or Persians. It's useless. We live in one region. We share a lot of history, and culturally we are very similar rather than different. But unfortunately, these are things that we need to work on more and create more solidarities regionally as well as internationally. Thank you.
Okay. I think Mr. Sinan mentioned many of, we share our experience as Iraqis. But why Marquis touched our generation, the 80th generation, the Kurdish novelist, I think the most important point is that it's touched the heart of the Kurdish collective memory. And this collective memory is including the mythos, including the telling, including the habit that we have. The important thing that I think that we are especially touch us as a novelist to the influence of Marquis, of Julio Cortázar, Mario Vargas Llosa, and Borges. Why? Because they offered us something, this technique of the storytelling historically. This technique couldn't give us a full of the storytelling. It is a technique that you can tell something about the reality, but there is the imaginary reality, and this imaginary reality is related to the historical reality. How? One point. For example, in 5 minutes, you can imagine in 5 minutes, less than 5 minutes, in 3 minutes, that 5,000 persons in Halabja died, disappeared. It's like what Marquis said. It was about 200 or 300 workers. They vanished. Okay, they disappeared. Or 250,000 civilian people. Now they are vanished in the Arabian Sahara. Yeah, it's a mass graves, and we don't know where they are. This kind of the history. This kind of the happening is the beyond the imagination, and I think this technique of the Marquis, especially Marquis, offered us how we can join between this two, the reality and the imagination. Thank you.
Well, in brief, just 2 comments. The first one, Iman, it's not a uniqueness. I think it's just because that's the focus of this essay. And as I tried to mention.
By the way, I forgot to mention that the title is kind of false advertising because you mentioned more than Che Guevara. So,
yeah.
Right. I'm saying it as tongue in cheek. I'm not.
Yeah. So.
But you mentioned a lot more influences from Latin America than Che Guevara in this article, right?
Yeah, but my other comments would be on Che Guevara and this title. But Palestinians read Frantz Fanon. They translated Frantz Fanon. He was read in prison walls by Palestinians. Africa was also there. Vietnam and all of these like revolutionary spaces and centers were translated. Maybe the enchantment with the Cuban Revolution, because it succeeded, and that's the main issue, is that a revolutionary movement can succeed and can build a new. That's why, like, that's one of why it became an inspiration, and then the Sandinista. So it's the success of these. But on the other hand, it's not just these inspirations. There were like on the ground material connections, cooperation, and in this case, like the PKK were also trained in the Palestinian camps in Lebanon. So strugglers, revolutionaries were trained in these different locations. So it's not the form of solidarity, and here I connect with what Rania was trying to say. Like today, when someone says that they are in solidarity with Palestinians, is that they are in solidarity and they want to train Palestinians how to struggle in a non-violent way and how to be to struggle in a civilizational way. So the issue of how things had been flattened and emptied, and here specifically like Che Guevara, like you'll find the pictures of Che Guevara everywhere today in the world, but the real essence of his revolutionary praxis and what does it mean had been so just turning the whole like the solidarity with the oppressed and the whole like revolutionary signs into empty signs that means nothing. And I think that's why like the whole co-optation of radical conceptions and reusing them in a new way that will never lead to a revolutionary praxis on the ground. So that's the difference between what's happening.
Yeah, briefly, I mean, I think we're all struggling with this. What does it mean to decenter the production of knowledge? I mean, we have to acknowledge that it means we're always mediated. We're mediated through the classroom. So this is a classroom that I don't know if it's not working. This is a classroom that happened in a school in the U.S. The language is used with the students is English. The language we're presenting here is in English. The way we're talking to each other is in English. So I think for all of us, for everyone who's trying to do that, this is a project in process. And I think it's about trying to create these kind of new spaces, whether the class or this forum and what other people are doing, to try to think about these things. So we definitely don't have the answer. It's just an attempt.
I guess I want to say a couple things, just to echo first what Hibba was saying, and that I was also very thankful that Rania pointed it out, that I think that this idea of getting out of the triangulation that is mediated by Europe and the US or by the global north, I think that what we were trying to do is to hack it or somehow harness it. And one of the things that is interesting to me that I wanted to point out is that this is the second opportunity, an incredible opportunity that I have to be in a forum like this, and that it's interesting to me that, for instance, in this panel, I'm actually the only Latin American here today, and that a lot of the influence that we seem to be tracing is unidirectional. To me, this is a wake-up call. This is a wake-up call to ask questions about the extent of the blindness of the enduring coloniality that we have in Latin America, and the ability to see and to understand ourselves and our identity, which I think is always relational. But I think for me, this opportunity, and I study race and nationalism, right, was to see out of how we understand ourselves, always in relation to the US, first to Europe, and then to the US, chronologically speaking, and having this opportunity to perhaps to think less about exceptionalism and also about how we understand ourselves, not by who we are not, but rather perhaps who we are somewhat like. And I think that particularly at this moment in Latin America, if there was ever, and I believe that there was actually a celebratory, victorious moment of revolution, a historical moment of revolution, when we see things like what has become of the Sandinista, of the Sandinista revolution, And just last week, the last moment of the Castro in Cuba, that we desperately need to look elsewhere to renew our own revolutionary histories.
The two books that were translated by Boal, by the artists, were the two books that were focused on techniques. So that there's a book called Games for Actors and Non-Actors, and Legislative Theater, which is very much focused on techniques. The precursor to that was the theory of the practice, called the Theater of the Press, and that was never translated into Arabic. So part of what I also wanted to say is that my tracing here is about the artists who are using Theater of the Press. So when the artists in this one kind of example that I'm using, are using Theater of the Press as theater, and as a form of theater. Different things happen when you have different groups who are not necessarily professional artists using Theater of the Press not as theater, but as a means, as a method to really look at and play out what resistance might look like, what the challenge of power dynamics could potentially inspire. So that was just another element that I wanted to put into there. I was also part of a forum that brought together South-South, and we also met in the North. And it brought scholars from Africa, from the Arab world, and from South America and Latin America. And we met in a kind of prestigious university in the US. And there was a very strong struggle in terms of how to move forward and what we could potentially do. We had beautiful conversations about relating our work to one another, but beyond that, it became very difficult. And so I think it'll be something when we think about tomorrow in terms of how to really build something much longer in advance, and that's why I very much appreciate the vision of this conference. One of the ideas that came out was to publish our work together, to use it as teaching materials. But that's also a struggle in terms of, are we publishing in English? Are we publishing, who's doing the translation, the resources? So I'm looking forward to see what kind of conversations come out of this.
So we can open it up to the audience for questions. We can go for about 10 more minutes in this panel today. So please, any questions to any of the panel members?
Hi, my question is for Huzan. When you were talking about femicides and the connections between them in Latin America and in the Middle East, it made me think a lot about the femicides in Ciudad Juarez, or the women going to work in the maquilladoras, and it also in Argentina. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about movements in the Middle East, such as the movements in Latin America, the Ni Una Menos movement. I wanted to see if you can think of any movements that are similar throughout Middle Eastern countries.
Okay, well, because Middle East is also different countries and societies and languages and cultures and so on, and I think there's also strong women's movements, strictly speaking, but also academics who have been really outspoken throughout generations. One of those writers who really inspired a lot of us was Nawal Saadawi, for example. I mean, that was the only probably it was written in Arabic. I read her when I was 16, for example, or 17, and it influenced me. So for us, there are a lot of figures like that, and now academics, based in UK and America and Middle East itself. So people do share these experiences, but also there are within each countries, there are women's organizations and movements. But one thing I would like to draw your attention is the nature of NGOization of the women's question and the women's movement and the neoliberalization. This is a big problem, and this is a big question. I have written extensively about it in Kurdish, at least for the Kurdish women in Kurdistan, that to be aware of it, and that not to be co-opted within so-called funding and projects, UN and USAID and this and DFID, and they make them busy the whole year without any particular result or actual project that has anything to do with battered women. So the violence continues. The people are angry with NGOs and women organizations. They say, you are the cause of the violence against women. So you have women organizations who actually don't, I mean, some of them do contribute in a good way, but so many of them has become a profession. And you have people who work in organizations, they call themselves program officer, manager, director, this and that, chief executive, expert, and so on. And when you actually, consultants, when you actually speak to them, they have no clue what is going on in actual society in terms of violence, in terms of all kinds of violence, you know, and they have no, I mean, so many of them are so posh and so well dressed, and they, honestly, I mean, we have to talk about that. And, you know, they wear the latest fashion from New York and London. I mean, sorry, you know, to be an activist and to work with women's rights, you have to be grassroots based. I mean, there is the woman in Rojava in Turkey, Kurdish woman. There, the situation is different. They basically don't take funds from Western governments. They basically organize cooperatives. They have women's councils in the neighborhoods and in a wider city. I mean, they are all voluntarily made up of grassroots women, not top down. I mean, there's nobody like a director or whatever. So the women gather, they speak about their problems, and they try to find solutions and support. There are these networks of solidarity between Kurdish women in Turkey and in Syria, but in Bashur, where I live in Iraqi Kurdistan, and also in Iraq as well, because I was involved with some women organizations, all they talk about is funding. They themselves become funding. Like, I've seen them in conferences here and there, like they just cry for funding. I mean, come on. Not everything is going to be solved through funding. You have to mobilize politically. So the entire question of women's rights activism and movements, I don't think there are movements anyway as such. I hope I'm not exaggerating, but really the entire women's question is depoliticized. It has become a word on paper, proposal, bureaucracy, funding, you know, jobs and careers, unfortunately, and the majority of women suffer. They lack representation, and they themselves cannot mobilize because there are these outlets, I call them these so-called women's entities, but they actually, there's a huge discontent, there's a huge, for example, disconnect between them. So this is really, there's a huge gap. That's why there are no movements as such. I mean, I hope my colleagues from the Middle East can correct me if there is. Thank you.
We have a couple questions, one in the back and one here, and then we'll go there. We're going to take a couple of questions, so we'll start with you.
Sure. Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Camilo Romero, and I'm glad that I'm in New York just by chance this week, since I live in Colombia and work with young people, in part supporting what is hopefully a peace process that, while it's controversial, I think has some seeds in what was mentioned here by the panelists. And we actually focus on theater. I'm not directly studied any art. I'm a training of a lawyer here at NYU. That's why they let me into these buildings. But I was impressed, not just what was said, but also with who is saying it. And I'll tell you why. In working with young people, the hardest part has been to have each of them see themselves as being part of the solution to whatever conflict they may be facing. That's especially true of working with young Colombianas, not just in Colombia, but also in the diaspora. And it was I feel very proud to see that the panel, not only this one, but I think the majority of the panels have female representation. And I think especially what was been discussed around how do we create social movements in an environment that tends to be funded by pale, male, and stale actors. Yeah. That I wonder if any of you, and the men too, I don't mean to discriminate against the brothers either, but what tools have you used to be either in your faculties or to organize the South conference that was mentioned, since I personally would like to bring that back to the youth I work with. Thank you.
Thank you. And then question here. He's coming with a microphone.
My question is about the location of academia in discussing activism and social movements. In the introduction, it was saying we're bringing together academics and activists to have these discussions. And then everybody I don't know if it's everybody, but almost everybody is identified with a particular academic institution. And not an activist institution. And so I'm just wondering how you think that positioning of this discussion influences it substantively and in terms of its impact.
Okay, thank you. And then there was that question there.
Hello, thank you guys so much. So this conference started out with a song that was playing when we all walked in, which is Somos Sur, and it's a collaboration between a Palestinian artist and a Chilean artist, I believe. So a lot of you talk about the parallels, so how one region influenced the other, but the connection, especially migration, transmobility, is over 150 years old. So I'm wondering if any of you have seen not just influences or parallels, but also connections and collaborations between the diaspora and the generations that have come after the initial diasporas.
Yeah, I'll answer that one very quickly. There are other panels that will engage with that question. There to come. And then we have a question here and then a question there, and then we'll open it up for answers.
Hi, my name is Claudia Norman. I produce a festival called Celebrate Mexico Now here in New York City. And the question is, you've been talking about influences and reading what you are reading and what are the kind of like the Bible as an influence for movements there. My question is, what are you reading today from contemporary writers that is influence you right now?
And then last question before we start answering.
Thanks. My name is Fernando Camacho. I'm coming from Madrid. I don't know if it's a question. It's mostly an experience I had in the Middle East. I would like to share. Maybe you could add something to this idea. Laura, my partner, and I just came back from Tunisia very recently. And one anecdote to start my comment. When people ask where we're coming from, when I said Spain, they all mention soccer players. Messi, Iniesta, Real Madrid, Barcelona Football Club. But when we answer Colombia, first they say Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, no, not from Colombia. Oh, Hugo Chavez, not from Colombia. And then, okay, we don't know anything from Colombia. It's interesting to make this connection because the reference from Spain are very different from the reference from Latin America. But still, when I've been traveling around Middle East, I've been visiting a lot of countries. I think I only saw one Che Guevara poster, and it was in Jerusalem. But I saw a lot of posters from Real Madrid, Barcelona Football Club, everywhere. And they could name all the players from all the different soccer teams. And even there is a very good film from Kurdistan. It's called El Clásico, and it's about the Kurdish men who travel to Madrid to see this soccer game. So I think sports, and especially soccer, is more important today for this connection between the Spanish-speaking world and Middle East. But also I would like to add, because we've been talking so much about this political connection from the left groups, but also we cannot forget that some of the dictators from the Middle East has very important connection with some of the dictators and even presidents from the different Latin American countries. Saddam Hussein used a lot of Chilean bombs to bomb Kurdistan and to bomb Iran. And also Argentina saw a lot of bombs to Saddam Hussein. And the majority of the Middle East community living in Latin America, not the refugees coming in the recent years, they participate in politics, and most of them they belong to right-wing parties. And they are full of contradictions. When I met refugees who live, for example, in Chile today, they say, I don't get along with the Palestinians here because we have totally different views of politics. So I think this connection is more complex than we can maybe discuss in a panel like here. And also in connection to this activism from the 70s, because it's a subject which interests me a lot, is the main difficulty to find documents because they operate in different underground, under clandestinity. So the only interesting information I could actually find out was the testimonies of the different actors. And I recommend you to read Ernesto Cardenal Memories, because he explains a lot about the Sandinistas and the Palestinian connection.
Okay, Fernando, I'm going to interrupt you, sorry, because we need to finish in a little bit. If we can go quickly and briefly through some of the responses, that would be nice.
Okay, it's only about Saddam Hussein and Castro. Yeah, I mentioned the cigar. It's only the small story. I observed, so I was young, the first visit of Fidel Castro. Yeah, before that, Ahmad Hassan Bakr or Saddam Hussein, they didn't want to visit the hospitals, to go in the public, or to be shown in TV. But after that, after the visit of Fidel Castro, he appeared on the jeep, and he appeared with his cigar. And after that, we saw another Saddam Hussein. Yeah, Saddam Hussein were everywhere, and Saddam Hussein were with his cigar. So every time when I see cigars, okay, I remember Castro and his visit, and how he brought this kind of the tradition to appear in public and to show yourself that you are the hero of the nation, the hero of the socialism. Yeah, that's.
I have a brief response to the compañero who was asking about resources. I think just very briefly, I think that precisely part of what we were speaking to here today is that for me, my resources are my sisters, right? The women of color some of whom are here today, Hiba, for instance, or my colleague Kara, and finding these opportunities for those collaborations that I think part of what we were pointing out is that they're rare, and because they're rare, they're so precious, and that we have to create them.
So we'll have a conversation after the panel.
Maybe, yeah, on the question of universities, academics, and activists. At least when I talk about the very context of Palestine, Birzeit University, and other Palestinian universities, maybe this binary is not so, because like it's the students at Birzeit who are being arrested by the colonizer, and even from the university campuses. So maybe these binaries are not so present in this case, and which makes what we're producing as academics more important, because it can be connected with struggle.
Well, thank you, everyone. And on that note, we'll break for lunch. But the panelists are around. There's long break.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Iman, so much. And I'd just like to, thank you. I'd just like to emphasize, thank you for the audience for the really wonderful questions. But I have to say that you guys asked questions that are going to lead into the next panels, because most of the panels will really deal with a lot of these questions. So please stick around for the rest of the day and also for tomorrow. Thank you all.